Miss Gilbert's Career by Josiah Gilbert Holland. Chapter 1. The Crampton Light Infantry and the Chalk Planetarium. Dr. Theophilus Gilbert was in a hurry. He had been in a hurry all night. He had been in a hurry all the morning. While the village of Crampton was asleep, he had amputated the limb of a young man 10 miles distant, attended a child in convulsions on his way home, and assisted in introducing into existence an infant at the house of his next-door neighbor. How sad an existence, how terrible a life, neither he nor the poor mother, widowed but a month, could imagine. Dr. Gilbert had taken an early breakfast, and still the black Canadian pony, with his bushy head down, the long hair over his eyes, and his shaggy fetlocks splashed with mud, flew around the village of Crampton, bearing the doctor in his gig, and stopping here and there at the houses of his patients without the straightening of a rein, as if the pony knew quite as well as the doctor where the sick people were, and had a private interest in the business. It was a familiar vision, this of the doctor and his pony and his gig. They had been intimately associated for many years, and formed what the good people of Crampton called an institution. If the doctor had died, the pony and the gig would have been useless. If the gig had broken down, the doctor and the pony would not have known what to do. If the pony had cast himself in his stable, he knew too much for that, and died of suffocation, the doctor and the gig could never have got along at all. The gig was very small, a little low-backed open chair, and how the doctor, who was a large burly man, ever sat down on it was a mystery to all the wondering boys of the village. But he did sit down in it a great many times in a day, and the stout springs bore him lightly, while the wheels plunged into the ruts or encountered the stones of the street, communicating to the rider a gently rising and falling motion, as he sat leaning forward, eager to get on and ready to jump off, like the figurehead of a ship riding an easy-going swell. Still, Dr. Gilbert, borne by the pony and the gig, hurried about the village. He plunged from the street into the house of a patient, and then plunged from the house into the street, and repeated the process so many times in the course of the morning that, had his limbs been less muscular, he would have dropped with fatigue. He paused but a moment at each bedside, and when came forth from it, with his case of medicines under his arm, and a doubtful aromatic atmosphere enveloping him, his strong eyes and firmly compressed lips expressed haste and determination, as if they said, "This work must be done at once, all done, done so that there may be no more to do during the day." The doctor's business on this particular morning was not, it must be confessed, wholly in the line of his profession. In truth, it had not been for a week. He had patients, certainly, but they did not monopolize his interest and attention. The young man whose limb he had abbreviated the previous night was told by the doctor, in his most sympathetic tones, that he would lose a great privilege in not being able to attend the exhibition. The little girl who had convulsions was threatened, soon after recovering consciousness, with being kept away from the exhibition if she did not take her medicines promptly. Poor Mrs. Blagg, with her baby on her arm, fatherless before it was born, was commiserated on the interference of the event of its birth with her enjoyment of the exhibition, and assured that if Mr. Blagg were alive, such an exhibition would do his heart good. Every family he visited was adjured not to fail of attending the exhibition, and the doctor greeted those whom he met in the street with, "You all are coming out to the exhibition, of course." Of course, everybody was going to the exhibition, for the doctor was a driving man, and when he undertook an enterprise, everybody understood that it would go through. He was willful, opinionated, industrious, indefatigable. The duties of his profession expended not more than a moiety of his vital supplies, and the surplus sought investment on every hand. He was a stirring man in the parish, in the church, and in all the affairs of the town. He was a stirring man in the public schools, and was, in fact, the leading spirit in them all. He made speeches at all the conventions of his town and county, with little apparent discrimination of their objects. In order to be always employed, he had studied a little law, obtained an appointment as a justice of the peace, and by degrees had become a sort of general administrator of the estates of his more unfortunate patients. The morning wore on, and the doctor at length turned in at his own gate and turned out the little black pony. Country wagons, well loaded with women and children, began to enter the village. Several ministers from neighboring towns drove in and alighted at the door of the Crampton parsonage. First came Reverend Dr. Bloomer, a very large man with a very large shirt collar and a very small wife, in a lopsided wagon, weak in the springs. Then came the Reverend Jonas Slyter, with Mrs. Reverend Jonas Slyter, whose generous physical proportions produced a visible depression of the wagon spring over which she sat. The Reverend Jonas Slyter, meanwhile, sitting very erect and looking very severe behind his white cravat and gold-bowed spectacles, as if he were dangerous, and had been lashed by the former to the back of his seat, and the latter had been put over his eyes for shutters. Following these came the Reverend J. de Silver Newman, a young sprig of divinity in brown gloves and a smart black necktie, without any wife, although, judging by his rather dashing toilet, not altogether unwilling to take in weight sufficient to balance his wagon. Barefoot boys from distant farms gathered upon the steps of the old church or assembled in the porch to watch the sexton while he rang the bell. A smiling old man with a bass viol under his arm and a grave young man with a flute in his pocket passed up the steps, entered the door, and were soon heard tuning their instruments and performing certain very uncertain flourishes, in which the flute flew very high and the bass viol sank very low. The bustle was increasing every moment. Little children, mysteriously bundled up, were deposited at the door of a schoolhouse across the common by men and women who handled them carefully, as if they were glass or porcelain. Then Dr. Gilbert was seen to issue from his house and to enter the house of his pastor, Reverend Mr. Wilton. Then he was seen to come out with Reverend J. de Silver Newman, followed by Reverend Dr. Bloomer and his wife, Reverend Jonas Slyter and his wife, Reverend Mr. Wilton and wife, the last of whom closed and locked the door. These dignitaries, instead of making their way to the church, crossed the common to the schoolhouse and disappeared within. The church filled rapidly in front of a stage temporarily erected and covered with a carpet of green baize. The only occupants of the stage were the two musicians, the older one of whom relieved his embarrassment by drawing his bow forward and backward upon a piece of rosin, while the younger continually took his flute in pieces to wet the joints, and then put it together again, and squinted along its length to see the holes were in range. There was a mysterious diagram upon the carpet, in French chalk, that taxed the curiosity of every eye, and provoked unlimited comment. At length the bell began to toll, and the assembly, momentarily augmenting and momentarily becoming excited with expectation, looked forth from the old church windows toward the schoolhouse. The door of the schoolhouse was opened as the bell closed its lazy summons, and the curiosity of Crampton was on tiptoe. First appeared Dr. Gilbert alone, as Grand Marshal, and he was followed by all the clergymen as aides. Then came the little boys dressed in extravagant little dresses, crosses between trousers and petticoats, the stoutest of whom, a little red-headed fellow of 5 summers, bore a banner inscribed with the words, "The Crampton Light Infantry." The Crampton Light Infantry did not march very well, it must be confessed. It was all that mothers and the wives of the pastors could do to keep them in line. One little boy insisted that his mother should carry him, and ultimately carried his point. Some looked down upon their clothes, some looked up and around to see who might be looking at their clothes. Others, with a grave thoughtlessness sadly beyond their years, seemed impressed with the proprieties of the occasion, and, among these, the little boy with golden curls, fair skin, and large dark eyes, who brought up the rear of the male portion of the procession, and who bore a second banner with this inscription: "There shall be no more thence an infant of days, for the child shall die 100 years old." Following this banner came the little girls in pairs, their eyes bright and their cheeks flushed with excitement, looking like so many blossoms of silk and muslin. Last of all, driving her flock before her, came Miss Fanny Gilbert, a tall, slender girl of 16, queenly, self-possessed, and triumphant. It was 30 years ago that this very sweet and simple pageant moved across the Crampton Common under a bright August sun, and nothing more beautiful has been seen upon the common since. It was during the infant school epidemic of the period that Dr. Gilbert, going from town to town, had taken the infection and communicated it to all Crampton, and he had selected his daughter Fanny as the best instrument upon which he could lay his hands to effect his purposes. He planned and she executed, and this, the great day of exhibition, had been looked forward to by the doctor with intense interest for many weeks. He should now demonstrate his own foresight and the capacity of the young minds to receive and retain instruction. He should inaugurate a new epoch in the history of education. There should be no more an infant of days, of years at most, in Crampton. The procession now reached the church and moved up the broad aisle. There was brisk cheering through the house and waving of handkerchiefs and fluttering of fans as the little creatures mounted the stage, the place to which they had become accustomed by several visits for rehearsal. The limited orchestra, already alluded to, had intended to receive the procession with appropriate musical demonstrations, but the confusion quite confounded them, and they shrank from the attempt. Order was at last secured. Some of the little boys had been set down very hard, as if it were difficult to make them sit still unless they were flattened. Others were pulled out from among the girls and made to exchange seats with the girls who had inadvertently strayed off with the boys. All were perched upon benches too high for them, and the row of pantalettes in front looked very much as if they were hung upon a clothesline. Then Dr. Gilbert came forward, and, rapping upon the stage 3 times with his cane, called the assembly to order. They had gathered, he said, to witness one of the distinguishing characteristics and proudest triumphs of modern civilization. It had been supposed that the time of children less than 5 years old must necessarily be wasted in play, that the golden moments of infancy must be forever lost. That time was past. As a result of modern improvement and among the achievements of modern progress, it had appeared that even the youngest minds were capable of receiving ideas, and that education may actually be begun at maternal breast, pursued in the cradle, and forwarded in the nursery to a point beyond the power of imagination at present to conceive. It was in these first years of life that there had been a great waste of time. He saw children before him in the audience older than any upon the stage, who had no knowledge of arithmetic and geography. Children, the most of whom had never heard the word astronomy pronounced. While these precious little ones had been improving their time, there were those before him who he had seen engaged in fishing, others in playing at ball, and others still, little girls, doing nothing but amusing themselves with their dolls. He had but a word to add. There were others who addressed them before the close of the exercises. He offered the exhibition as demonstration of the feasibleness of infant instruction. He trusted he offered it in a humble spirit, but he felt that he was justified in pointing to it as an effectual condemnation of those parents who had denied to their infants the privilege of attending the school. Administering this delicate rap upon the knuckles of such parents as had chosen to take charge of their own infants, the doctor turned to Reverend Mr. Wilton and invited him to lead the audience in prayer. Like many prayers offered to the Omniscient, on occasions like this, the prayer of Mr. Wilton conveyed a great deal of information pertinent to the occasion, to the being whom he addressed, and incidentally, of course, to the congregation. It was now Miss Gilbert's office to engage the audience, and her little troop of infantry was put through its evolutions and exercises to the astonishment and delight of all beholders. They sang songs, they repeated long passages of poetry in concert, they went through the multiplication table to the tune of Yankee Doodle. They answered with the shrill sing-song voice of parrots all sorts of questions in geography. They recited passages of Scripture. They gave an account of the creation of the world and of the American Revolution. They told the story of the birth of Christ and spelled words of 6 syllables. They added, they multiplied, they subtracted, they divided. They told what hemisphere, what continent, what country, what state, what county, what town they lived in. They repeated the names of the presidents of the United States and the governors of the Commonwealth. They acted a little drama of Moses in the bulrushes, and they did many other things till, all through the audience, astonishment grew into delight, and delight grew into rapture. "Most astonishing," exclaimed Reverend Dr. Bloomer. "Very remarkable," responded Reverend Jonas Slater. "Perfectly. Beats everything I ever saw," said Reverend J. De Silver Newman, very flush of enthusiasm and very short of adverbs. Dr. Gilbert calmly surveyed his triumph, or turned from one to another of the pastors upon the stage as some new and surprising development of juvenile acquisition was exhibited, with a nod of the head and a smile which indicated that he was indeed a little surprised himself. He had never been so proud of his daughter as then. Reverend J. De Silver Newman was also receiving powerful impressions with regard to the same young woman. In fact, he had gone so far as to wonder how much money Dr. Gilbert might be worth. But then he had gone as far as this with 100 other young women and come back safe. The musicians, who had been kept pretty closely at work accompanying the children in their songs, moved back their chairs at the hint from Miss Gilbert and took a position behind the pulpit. There was a general moving of benches and making ready for the closing scene and the crowning glory of the exhibition, a representation of the solar system on green baize by bodies that revolved on 2 legs. The mystery of the chalk planetarium was solved. Out of a chaos of frocks and juvenile breeches, Miss Gilbert proceeded to evoke the order of a sidereal system. "The sun will take his place," said Mrs. Gilbert, and immediately the red-headed boy who bore the banner of the Crampton Light Infantry stepped to the center of the planetarium with a huge ball in his hand, mounted upon the end of a tall stick. Taking his stand upon the chalk sun and elevating the sphere above a head that would have answered the purpose of a sun quite as well, he set it whirling on its axis, and thus came the center of the system into location and into office. "Mercury," said Miss Gilbert, and out came a smart little chap with a smaller ball in his hand and began walking obediently around the chalk circle next to the sun. "Venus," and sweet little Venus rose out of the waves of muslin tossing on the side of the stage and took the next circle. "Earth and her satellite," called forth a boy and a girl, the latter playing moon to the boy's earth, revolving around him as he revolved around the sun, and with great astronomical propriety, making faces at him. Mars was called for, and it must be acknowledged that the red planet was very pale and very wary looking. "Jupiter and his satellites," and the boy Jupiter walked upon the charming circle with a charming circle of little girls revolving around him. So Saturn with its 7 moons, and Gorgium, Sidus, otherwise Herschel, otherwise Uranus, with its 6 attendant orbs, took their places on the verge of the system, and slowly, very slowly, moved around the common center. But there was one orbit still unfulfilled, and that was a very eccentric one. It was not all described upon the green baize carpet, but left it, and retired behind the pulpit, and was lost. The system was in motion, and, watching every revolving body in it, stood the system's queen, indicating by her finger that Uranus should go slower, or Mercury faster, and striving to keep order among the subjects of her realm. The music, meantime, grew dreamy and soft, in an attempt to suggest what is called the music of the spheres, if any reader happens to know what kind of music that is. Heavenly little bodies indeed they were, and it is not wonderful that many eyes moistened with sensibility as they mingled so gracefully and so harmoniously upon the plane of vision. Still, the eccentric orbit was without an occupant, and no name was called. At last, a pair of large dark eyes appeared from behind the pulpit, and behind the eyes of a head of golden hair, and behind the head a wreath of floating golden curls. This was the unbidden comet, advancing slowly toward the sun, almost creeping at first, then gradually increasing his velocity, intent on coming in collision with no other orb, smiling not, seeing nothing of the audience before him, and yet absorbing the attention of every eye in the house. The doctor's eyes beam with unwonted interest. Miss Gilbert forgets Mars and Venus and looks only at the comet. At last the comet darts around its perihelion, and the golden curls are turned to the audience in full retreat toward the unknown region of space behind the pulpit from whence it had proceeded. The house rang with cheers, and the doctor was prouder than before, for this was his little son Fred, the bearer of the banner with the long inscription, Miss Gilbert's darling brother, and the brightest ornament of the Crampton Light Infantry. Miss Gilbert clapped her hands 3 times, and her system dissolved, returned to its original elements, and stepping forward to her father, she announced that her exhibition was closed. Reverend Dr. Bloomer was then informed that there was an opportunity for remarks. He rose and addressed the assembly with much apparent emotion. "We have seen strange things today," said Reverend Dr. Bloomer. "We have seen a millennial banner waving in Crampton and a millennial exhibition within the walls of the Crampton Church. There shall be no more hence. You will observe that I say hence, not thence. An infant of days, for the children of Crampton shall die 100 years old." Dr. Bloomer said that he did not feel authorized to speak for others, but he felt that he had learned much from the exhibition. He felt that he should go away from it a wiser man, with the new apprehensions of the powers of the human soul and the preciousness of time. The hour was coming, he doubted not, in the progress of the race, when knowledge would be so simplified and the modes of imparting it would become so well adapted to the young mind that the child of 5 would begin his process of education where the fathers left off theirs. These little ones had already taught him many things, and God would perfect his own praise out of the mouths of babes and sucklings. Then, turning to Miss Gilbert, he thanked her for himself, and assumed to thank her on behalf of the audience for the great gratification she had given him and them, and for the example of usefulness and industry she had set those of her own sex and age in the community. "Young woman," said Dr. Reverend Bloomer with an emphasis that brought the tears to Miss Gilbert's eyes, "you have a career before you. May God bless you in it." Then Reverend Jonas Slider rose to make only a few little remarks, as he modestly characterized them. He had been particularly struck with the other banner, and while his brother Bloomer was disposed to take the millennial view of the subject, he was inclined to the military. These children were undertaking the battle of life early. They had enlisted under a captain who had already led them to a victory prouder than ever achieved by a Caesar or Napoleon, an American Joan of Arc, whose career of usefulness, if she should keep her sword bright and her escutcheon untarnished, would far surpass in glory that of the world-renowned heroine whose name he had mentioned. Heaven forbid that he should flatter anyone. He despised a flatterer, but he felt that he was honoring Caesar and Napoleon and Joan of Arc in their graves by mentioning their names in connection with such achievements as he had witnessed on that occasion. It is true that Reverend Jonas Slider rather mixed things in his more ambitious rhetorical flourishes on all occasions, but the language sounded well, and being accompanied with appropriately magnificent action, it was accustomed to bring down the house. It did not fail before the Crampton audience, but the rounding of his period left him vacant. Standing back, as if to wait for the subsidence of the applause, his mind retired behind his glasses and thrust out its antennae in every direction to feel for his theme. But he could not find it. In his desperation, he turned at last to the children and said in his blandest tones, "Little children, can you tell me who Caesar and Napoleon and Joan of Arc were?" "Caesar is the name of my dog," responded the little golden-haired comet. "Napoleon is the name of my dog," cried Mars. There was an awful pause, a suppressed titter, when precious little Venus, in a shrill voice, with an exceedingly knowing look in her face, said that Joan of Arc was the name of the dog that Noah saved from the flood. What wonder that Crampton roared with laughter. What wonder that Dr. Bloomer shook with powerful convulsions. What wonder that Miss Bloomer and Miss Wilton nudged each other. What wonder that Dr. Gilbert and Miss Fanny Gilbert bit their lips with mingled vexation and mirth. What wonder that Reverend Jonas Slider grew red in the face. But Reverend Jonas Slider was up. The sole question with him was how to sit down. What should he say? He waited until the laughter had subsided, and then he told the children they had not got to that yet. But their excellent teacher would doubtless tell them all about it the next term. The next term? The speaker had found a theme, for he deemed it his duty to improve all occasions of public speech for giving religious instruction. From the next term of school, he easily went over to the next term of existence and told the Crampton Light Infantry that in order to make that a happy term, they must all become soldiers of the cross and fight valiantly the battles of the church militant. Then Reverend Jonas Slider generously declared that he would occupy the time no longer, but would make way for others. Reverend J. de Silver Newman rose and came forward. He was very red in the face and very shaky in the knees. He regretted that he was left without a banner, there having been but two in the procession, and those having been appropriated by the gentleman who had preceded him. He took it as a hint that he should say but little, and he should say but little. The children were tired and eager for their refreshments.